Okay, everyone, thanks for coming. This is going to be a talk about the PowerShell extension for VS Code and how you can make more out of it. You might be new to it, so this talk is actually very much focused on entry-level features. I will still show features here and there that could be even useful for experienced users, but there's a focus on, I've used VS Code a little bit, I've maybe installed the extension, I don't know what other features are there that can help me whilst using VS Code as an editor, and this is to show some of the things in there. Thanks to the sponsors for PS Day that wouldn't have made this day possible, so Patch My PC and Chocolatey, thank you very much. We're going to be going through an introduction, couple of simple features to get started, looking at templates, how we can debug our scripts in different ways, the settings support of the extension in there, a small but new feature, tab completion for splatting, how we can do testing a bit easier using Pesta, and one of my favorite things, because I'm the maintainer of PS Script Analyzer, is code formatting and code analysis. I thought of doing something like that, but actually, scrap it. Let's ask the new Bing, who am I? And let's see what the system is saying. So this is a new ChatGPT-based Bing. The difference to ChatGPT is that it's binging for me and combining it with searches. And it's going through various sources. You will see the MVP site, LinkedIn, and gives me a nice summary. And actually, I think that's a briefer and a nicer summary than I could have done myself. So I do work for Avanade. I've worked in DevOps space for many years as a hands-on engineer, as a manager, have seen many things from the software development lifecycle, as well as the platform on the Azure side. So if any of that is interesting to you as well, speak to me. There's lots of those topics I'm interested in as part of my job. If you go to this talk, then there's maybe other talks you might want to revisit as well. So there's one by Justin Grote that he did at PSConf last year. Ooh, sorry. There's one by Tyler Lienhardt, so he's one of the original developers on the PowerShell extension for VS Code. He's now actually moved to the VS Code team, but he was very much involved in the PowerShell extension and is showing very useful features, because some of them, they're not very well documented, and it's always good to see it in action, how a pro is using it. PowerShell extension for VS Code. So if we go to VS Code, then it'll be very demo heavy. So excuse me that I don't always go full screen on the presentation, because we'll be flipping back and forth so many times. Most of you would have gone through the step of installing the PowerShell extension. So we search for PowerShell, and there's actually two. There's the stable, as people like to call it, and the preview one. You can choose now either of them. In the past, we recommended going for the preview extension because it was functionally better, maybe a bit less stable. Now they're releasing it on a monthly basis, and both are very stable. I would say preview, as a preview, naturally is a little bit less stable, but I wouldn't say the preview has got features that you absolutely need and cannot wait a month for. So if you do want to give feedback, definitely use the preview. If you can't wait a month, definitely try those out. But equally, you're not being held back by using the stable version, because any new update will very shortly come to it. You can only use one of the two. So although kind of both installed, you can only have one enabled. And if you want to switch between them, you can use the right click and say enable, and then disable the other. And all you have to do afterwards is a reload for that. So if we switch back here, disable, and then that should do it. So now we've got the extension. What does the extension do for us? So say we want to do some inline writing of code. We don't want to have a PowerShell file. I do get some completion there. It comes from a GitHub Copilot, so ignoring that for a second. But other than that, I don't get much syntax highlighting. And that's because we have to tell VS Code that this is PowerShell code. It has some intelligent analysis when you paste bigger pieces of code in to determine whether it's JavaScript or PowerShell. But we have to tell it now it's PowerShell. So using the command palette, Control-Shift-P, there's various commands. And the one that I always like to use is setting language. Change language mode. And then we can tell it it's PowerShell code. Oh, and now we do get the syntax highlighting, and we would get more tab completion on the options that we have. The extension is also telling me about versions of the PowerShell, which it can even update for you. At the moment, I'm holding off for that because I'm using Chocolatey. I don't want to change my flow there, but it's nice as well. If you haven't been on a station for a while and you want the extension, let the updates for you. That is an option, and that will use the MSI-based version on Windows. What you might have noticed is that the moment I set the language to PowerShell, is that a new tab here showed a PowerShell extension. It's a terminal, and I can use that terminal. I can configure it which version of PowerShell to use. It will automatically pick PowerShell 7 if it can detect that it's installed. And what this terminal does, it's working behind the scenes to provide information to you. And you can use it later on when we come to the debugging session. It will come in useful instead of having to switch between terminals. Other than that, my recommendation is you can use it, but similar to the terminal in the ISE, behavior might be different because it's used as a backend for other things, for providing information to the editor. So if you're running a script that is very important, that cannot be stopped at some point and needs to have the right quality, don't use that terminal. Any sorts of experimental work, absolutely fine to use this terminal. And you can switch between a normal terminal and the one for the PowerShell extension here. So next thing is going to be templates, commands, integrated terminal. So we have it installed. We see it gives us highlighting some tab completion. What else can it do? Similar to the ISE, you can have a template for like a function that you can enable. So if I start typing function, tab complete, then it gives me the boilerplate code. And as you've seen, it does the advanced function as well. It can even go as far as, let me go back to a normal function one, where we might have some parameters. Say I want to do some help, and if I type here hash and another hash, and say you have more parameters here, it would automatically put those parameters in there for me, so I don't have to type it out. So that is very useful to bootstrap things. Very similar as well if you're using a pester. So let me see if that works. I think there's one for describe. Is there? No, maybe I misremember. But there's lots of templates in there that you can explore that allow you not having to copy-paste your templates from somewhere or maintain them. And because it's open source, you can contribute them back. If you find something useful, you could ask the author of the VS Code extension, do you want to consider this template? Because I'm keeping having to type certain things out, and they're usually quite glad to add that in there. Commands. So apart from being an editor, there's functions you can make available. So if we go to the command palette and just filter for PowerShell, we'll find all commands that are registered from the PowerShell extension. And those commands can help you configure it, do certain things. So if you look there, my most popular one is restart session. That is an easy way of restarting this PowerShell terminal. It can be sometimes where the extension gets stuck. Sometimes I want to reset settings. That can be very useful. Or just resetting the state Like say I've been, I don't know, declaring some variables, I want to get rid of them. I don't have to close it and reopen it. I can just use the command for it. There is ISE mode that brings you very similar UI and color theme. There's other ones, debug pester test, and we'll be using that later on, but not via the command. We can expand aliases there, but I will show later on we can use formatting to do that in an easier way, getting help for a command. So there are lots of additional things that the extension offers that are not immediately visible in the UI just by clicking around, and that's always worthwhile exploring in VS Code. The other thing that is not very visible is settings. So if I just go to my user settings, and again I'm using the command palette to navigate to make it easier. And I could just start with PowerShell as well, and I see lots of different settings to explore that allow me to customize the extension in various ways. I will explain some of them, like the code formatting one. But it's always worthwhile pointing out, go through them, have a look. Is there things that could help you tweak your workflow or features that are not enabled by default? Integrated terminal, debugging. So let's use the integrated terminal now to show an example of how I can debug a script. So say it's a simple script like this one here. I can press F5, and I've already set the breakpoint here, but just to show, you can set a breakpoint by navigating to the left and just clicking, and it lights up the red circle here. And if I press F5 now, it will run this script, and it should stop at line 2. Open launch.json. Okay, so we first need a debug configuration. That's a good point. So launch.json is a file that is describing the debug configuration. So the debug pane here on the left is allowing us to configure it. So if we create a launch.json file, an extension file. It's almost like with the enable, disable, it's not recognizing it anymore. So let me just restart VS Code, because I think I might have confused it by doing the enable and disable. I think that's maybe one of the rare occasions where you actually want to restart the entire VS Code. Okay, that works better now. So I pressed F5, and it stopped on line 2, meaning it executed the first line already. So we can explore variables that are being set here, and objects as well. We could drill down, like in the args object, and look at properties, which can be very useful when going through it. We can use the integrated terminal here to play around with whatever state we've got here. So I cannot just view it, I could execute any command that changes state. So that, say, for example, you're developing a script, and you still haven't developed the line that you want to write. You can go up to that line, experiment with it, and once you have found the line, you can go back, copy-paste it in your editor. Because sometimes you need to set up your environment for certain things and variables to be set up in a certain way. So that can be very useful. And this one has to be the PowerShell extension here by using this type of debugging. We could step over our code where we step line by line. If we've got a function, we could step into it, and we can step out. So be mindful where you set your breakpoints, because sometimes you have to go from a higher to a lower level in the stack, and that just comes with experience. Where's the best place to place breakpoints so you can stop your code and inspect and take it from there. So this is the simplest way of debugging. So now if we create this launch.json file, there's 4 options that it offers us. Launch current file, it's kind of similar to what we did now, launch script or interactive session. So I'm going to add interactive session. Because say, for example, we had a script and we needed a parameter, and it's mandatory. The launch script option is not going to work. So what we need to do is attach something to it beforehand. So the way we can achieve that, so now that we've got this one added to launch.json, which it has done for us here, and I recommend checking it into your Git repository. That goes under your .vs Code folder. Normally, folders starting with dot are quite often ignored, like the .git folder. The .vs Code folder is actually meant to be checked in because it contains, for example, settings that you want to have specific to your repository. You might want to mandate a certain style in terms of the braces or other code style that you want to enforce. But you want that just for your repository. And people might have different user settings. And this is a way how you can override user settings by checking the settings.json file in. And very similar as well, the launch.json will be debugging configuration. For PowerShell, they're quite generic. They don't need much project-specific tweaking, but other languages, you might want to tweak them. But it means usually for a new project, you end up having to create a launch.json file and checking it in so that you've got the option, like here now, of attaching to an interactive session. So what this one does now, as I press play or F5, I see the pane here, which is telling me it's attached to the PowerShell extension terminal here. But it hasn't hit anything because we haven't run a script. The F5 option before was a convenience option. Now only if we end up calling the script will it stop there. So if I was to run the script, put something there, then it will actually, when we've run it, be able to stop there. If I was to, let me reattach it again. The importance is that this goes for the PowerShell extension. If I was to execute this in my other terminal, it wouldn't stop there because it doesn't know what to attach to.
So on that, if you had an untitled file that you just copied a script from the internet into, does that allow you to do an interactive debugging on that file? Does it have to be a saved file?
So yes, for debugging it needs to be saved. Yeah, it was brought up a couple of years ago. It's too complex to get working from an unsaved file. Something that has been asked, and that's maybe something more advanced, but I want to only briefly show it. What if I had a PowerShell terminal there that is set up in a special way? Or I just want to have real confidence that it works in vanilla PowerShell. I can actually do that. And if we go back to the launch.json file and add another option, I'm just searching for PowerShell, we can attach to PowerShell host process. So we would need to know the process ID for that first. And there's a variable $PID in PowerShell that tells us that. So this terminal ends in 68. And if I was to use the other configuration for attaching, attach to host process, it's asking me now, and I need to know the process ID. You can help yourself sometimes by labeling the PowerShell process that would show up here, so that you don't have to look it up by process ID. But if we do this, and notice how it actually switched the terminal to PowerShell extension, but we can't type anything in there. It's because it has taken over, it's using it, and therefore deliberately blocking as well, because it's telling you that's not the system you should be using now. So we run it from here, and it stops here. And so any state we see here is coming from that terminal here. And if you want to inspect anything you see here, it has broken here. So anything would have to do would need to happen via this terminal. There is, I think, an option here now where we could have things happening here. There's a debug console, but you have to type your commands one by one, which is not very interactive. But yeah, there's a limited way how you can still use it, but it is coming from this other terminal. Okay, so much around debugging. Settings is going to be very quick. Like I mentioned, you should actually check them in. And here are some examples of what I use on some of my other repositories. I set the formatting style. You might want to say how many tabs you want, whether you want to trim trailing white space. Some of the things that are like project specific that you want to enforce, have them checked in the rest. Keep them in your user settings. Use features like settings sync in VS Code, so you can sync across devices if that is a use case that you've got. Testing, okay. So if we look at Pester, this is kind of how some of my tests do look like. And I found myself repeating a scenario of, okay, I want to run this test. So I'm going to right-click on the tab, press copy path, and then I'm going to type in invoke, Pester, copy-paste, enter. Great. It's a bit tedious. It does show you ways of running a describe block, but not the whole test suite. So what I have actually contributed to a year or two ago was a context menu that now, if you want to run the whole file, you could right-click either here, and you have to go a bit down and say run Pester tests, and then it does the equivalent of what it just did in a terminal without having to type everything out and get the path. You do get the same menu here. Because the menus have become quite long nowadays, as you've seen, you have to scroll down quite a bit. And that's something that is coming from the PowerShell extension. And that can make it useful, because we get those blocks only on the individual describe blocks, but quite often we end up having multiple of them. And as you see, there's a debug option as well that would attach the debugger for you automatically, but it would use the PowerShell extension terminal for that. Otherwise, if you want to use a different one, you would have to go via the manual procedure, attaching to the process that you want to attach to. So PS Script Analyzer, some people that know me because of the work on that module. And this is a module that provides code analysis, but also formatting in there. The PowerShell extension ships with this module already, so you don't need to have it installed, which is great. It has also moved its docs now to mslearn.com, so you don't need to go onto GitHub anymore. You can find it on their official websites. The interaction is happening a bit indirectly, so you don't see it, but I will show you some specific examples when it comes to formatting. So let's just skip splitting for a moment and go to formatting. So one of the main settings is the code formatting preset. That gives you 3 options around the brace style that are most common ones. And they're summarized here with examples quite well. The link here you will find actually when you look at the setting. So let me see, where do we have this? If you hover over, you will see the link there to see the examples. And it mainly resolves around brace on the same line or new line like here. It's kind of a Linux versus Windows/C# style. So whatever you prefer, pick what you've got. And what it does is it does set a bunch of subsettings that you can still additionally override. So we see here, ignore one line block, new line after close brace, etc. It's what you would call a meta setting. So it's controlling something like 10 settings to give you this kind of style. But you have the option of individually saying, well, actually, this style I prefer a little bit more than the other one. You would have noticed here I've got lots of those enabled, and they're non-default settings. They're non-default because of the expense or time it takes for the extension to do the work, but they're very useful, and I highly recommend considering some of them because they can make your work so much more productive. So one is around auto-correcting aliases. So let me give an example of. So an alias is, for example, GCI or get child item. CD is an alias as well. It just stands for set location. You can hover over it where it shows you the squigglies. And those squigglies come from PS Script Analyzer because it's saying you shouldn't be using aliases. So there is a quick fix option where you can click and either look at the documentation to first understand the rule, why it's complaining, or let it automatically correct it here. Quite often we find there's loads of them, especially in existing code. And we can actually, instead of clicking on each of them, we can let the code editor do it all for us. So I could select here and use the formatting command, Control KF, and it formats it for me. And you can just imagine selecting the whole thing and doing it for all the aliases that you want. Then there's other ones that use correct casing. So sometimes when you type things out, you know the command, you just type it out, it's lowercase, it's fine. But the perfectionist will always be like, no, it needs to have the right casing. And again, with this setting, corrects the casing for you. There is, if you want to do the whole file, if you look for format, that's a VS Code feature, and it automatically knows to use the PowerShell formatter to just type format document, and then you don't need to do Control A and then Control KF. That makes it very convenient to format when you're done. Some people even customize it to a way to format automatically on document save, which is very convenient, but you need to weigh up the time it takes. If you've got 1,000 files, that might take a second or two. So depending on what works for you, how big the scripts are that you work with, consider some of those trade-offs, or whether you don't strictly work with source control and you're developing scripts, don't want things to accidentally be changed. At the end of the day, it's still software that can go wrong. So it's always good to have some sort of backup instead of letting the system do everything for you, which it can do a lot. But there's always the potential of things going wrong, where sometimes if the syntax is invalid and you're just in the middle of typing things out, it sees code in a different way, and then it can even delete that part of the code because of the invalid syntax. So just be careful. I personally like to do it deliberately when I do format, rather automatically every minute or unsafe, or just limiting the amount of sections that I do so I can actually inspect the difference. White space between parameters is one that we can show above here quite nicely together with other ones. It's just a visual improvement here, nothing functional, but it's very nice at the end of the day, especially if you hand this over to a client where you want things consistent. That's what they will be assessing the quality against, instead of the script quality, which quite often is hard to assess for a client. So those are just things we always have to do when we deliver code of good quality, is the consistency. Pipeline indentation style is one that I added a couple of years ago, and it was a bit tricky because there was quite a few bugs that came out of it. And getting it implemented correct took me a while, but I think we're finally getting there. So the idea is to increase indentation with every pipe, and you can control that, and that's a non-default setting. By default, it wouldn't do anything like that. Now I'm telling increase it for the first pipeline. I could tell it increase it after every pipeline. And then the third one should get expanded as well. Using constant strings. is one where, for example, you've got code and you just use the double quotes, but you're not actually interpolating it, and you could get it to correct it to use single quotes. I need to remove that, it doesn't like that. So if we go back, format, something is broken with the formatter right now. The formatter is working, just not that specific one. There we go, yeah. So changes double to single quotes, but only if you're not interpolating things. If I was to interpolate things in there, that was to break that, then it wouldn't do that. So that there's some intelligence baked into it. Control KF doesn't do anything there. So to summarize that, have a look at the settings available there, and those are some specific ones I want to highlight that are not enabled by default that can make your life much easier. Code analysis, so we've seen already one of them that it highlighted, which was the alias rule, but there's a couple of more rules in there, and again, not all rules are enabled by default. So there's one rule here that should actually flag, but it doesn't. So this rule is around warning, where maybe you've switched language and you actually you didn't mean to write equals. You maybe actually in your head meant to write dash equal, but you just forgot. It's very common if you switch languages to forget that, even although it's very native to PowerShell to do comparison this way. So I think there's around 30 different rules in terms of code analysis that the tool can run, but by default only around 10 are being run. And that again is a performance thing where people found it's taking too long for the extension to do the work, or the CPU is high. But if you want to have deep analysis, you can enable that. And the best way how I recommend to enabling that is by using settings files. So if you look at the PS script analyzer documentation, you will find that if you name your settings file in a specific way, like this one here, then it will automatically pick it up. And that applies to both the script analyzer commands, if you use them directly, or the VS Code extension. They have to be placed in the root, though, for it to automatically pick it up. There used to be a setting for it that you could point it to, but now on start, it would automatically know. So as I said, on start, so the way I get it to pick up the change here, I could change things inside the file once it has seen the file, but before it hasn't seen the file with such a name, because I just renamed it, so it hasn't picked it up. But now it's picking it up, and it's giving me the warning there. So what I have done in this file is actually just presented an empty hash table. The formatting type for PS script analyzer is a PowerShell hash table. And if I was to give you a more concrete example here, is where I can customize certain rules. Say, I want to run exactly those rules. There's an include rules that you can specify, or you can say all of them except this one. And then you can maybe customize it and say, oh, this specific one I do want to allow. But for me, this is the simplest, quickest hack that allows you to run all the rules just using defaults. But it does allow you to change up your game from running 10 code analysis rules to 30. That might give you more additional input. So we've shown this here. We can have a look at one of them, because the question is, how do you come up with this that I've seen? So in the documentation for it, for all the rules, you will usually find examples here, and configuration settings because they're different for each rule. Meaning you could copy-paste this as an example. This example here refers to the whole settings file, and you will find repeated patterns between them that call out to things like rules, include rules, and you would naturally merge them. You wouldn't have multiple blocks of rules. I guess that's the only thing to notice if you start to customize more and more. But my recommendation is start with an empty hash table, see if there's too many rules or some rules that you don't like, some rules that you want to customize, and that's great. This settings file you could use later on as well if you want to use CI/CD and run a script analyzer, because if you were to run the command from the pscript analyzer module, then it would pick that up automatically. Bit of a word of warning, I said the extension terminal is special. I can actually, even if I do dot here, not always run it correctly, so because the extension comes with it and it deals with it behind the scenes, I always recommend running invoke script analyzer from a separate terminal to get the same results. But because the way the tool works, it uses the same sort of defaults and assumptions where it picks up the settings file based on its name automatically if you name it like that. If you want to name it a different way and have multiple ones, you can be explicit and point it to it via a settings option and check that into your settings.json. Okay, so let's go back to just one more thing, which was splatting. That's quite a recent feature, and as they announce it, there's usually not big announcement, it's just release notes, so it's very easy to miss some of those things. So splatting is a way how, instead of having dash parameter and parameter value, we can accumulate things in a hash table. So why do we want to use that? So for me, it's the optics. It's very nice. The line does not get very long. We can align the equal. Actually, via formatting, it does the alignment for us automatically. But there's also scenarios where you call a commandlet multiple times, but with a different variation of parameters where quite often the values are the same except for one. So you could imagine having a hash table of common parameter values that you pass to it and say, this one except this one. And that means you end up with way less code because you can just customize the hash table as you progress for each loop, and then it just ends up being passed to the commandlet itself. The disadvantage for a long time was, if you wanted to modify the code later on, it's just a hash table, so the extension wouldn't know what the commands are of get child item, because they don't even know how the variable is wired up to the command. But now it does, and now I could press here control space and actually do see all the parameters of the commandlet, which is nice, and I think was quite a big breakthrough, and I think will allow the usage of splatting to be increased more and more, because maintenance-wise, this was a bit of a bummer for a while.
So on that, what happens if you do a get child item params and then you have like a new child item params? What does autocomplete do, or does it just kind of fail and ignore it?
Do you mean calling it again later?
Yeah, but with a different command, so it's technically got a different set of...
Okay, like stop process.
It's a good idea, but yeah, does autocomplete now work on the param block?
So what I expect is probably in terms of implementation detail, it probably looks for the closest command to infer what are the options. So it will still use get child item. If I was to drag it up, so I always like to use Alt up and down. It's very easy to move lines of code around. Probably it picks up sub-process now. So yeah, those are the process ones. You could still use it technically if you've got commandlets that have a shared set of parameters that are the same. Quite often there's get and set commandlets that share a subset of the parameters and you just use that, then you can use it. There's, have a look at the splitting documentation. There's an option of saying this plus change, I don't know, path equals this, so you don't have to change the hash table. But that's a feature that they only recently added in 7.2, I think. But yeah, splitting recently got enhanced, so you don't end up having to either clone the hash table or modify it, and then you have to keep track of state. Have a look at the splitting documentation. It should tell you a way how you can override on an inline basis without modifying the hash table itself. That can achieve that. But like you said as well, have different commands that is still possible. In terms of the tab completion there, it only picks up the next one. Yeah, I guess there's always going to be a limit to how much it can infer.
Handled it way better than I expected it to be honest.
Yeah, there used to be a community extension that used to do that, but it broke every few months because the extension changed its implementation. Okay, with that, we're getting close to the end of time. Are there any other questions? And thank you for your attention, by the way, and thanks as well for early questions as well.
So the good way to start with PS Script Analyzer would be to create an empty PS Script Analyzer
Settings.
PSD, and then add, yeah, and start with empty, and then add the rules by.
Yeah, because you want to run all rules, and by default it doesn't do that for you in the editor. You can still, if you run invoke the script analyzer, it runs all the rules for you, irrespective of that. That is just a setting of the PowerShell extension in VS Code, where it chooses to use fewer of them, and yeah, it runs all the code analysis rules. You could also change it, and some people actually do that. There's two types of rules in PS Script Analysis. There's code analysis and there's formatting rules. When I'm running invoke script analysis, it only runs rules of type code analysis. And you might want to run some formatting rules and actually say, oh, wait, this was not formatted correctly. Maybe you've got some, you can write your custom rules as well. It can highlight it this way. So you can actually add in any kind of rule that you wish to be analyzed.
Is there an option to do that from the command panel?
As in like editing the settings file?
No, as in like Control-Alt-P, invoke script analyzer.
Well, that's actually what it's doing behind the scenes here. So if we look at the squiggles, that are
for the entire rule set, because you say it's only like 10 of the rules by default. So what I'm saying is that yes, you want that for you want the 10 rules for performance on like a day-to-day type thing basis, and say just before you want to do a commit, I want to run the entire rule set. So from a VS Code convention perspective, I would want to go like Control-Alt-P, run invoke script analyzer, it would then give me the output of the full rule set.
So I think what you might want is, and I used it for script analyzer itself, is I'm using dedicated commands. So let me show you. Similar to launch.json, or actually quite like launch.json, you can run custom commands. I used it to run like a specific test suite or the build. So if we
Nothing built into the PowerShell extension to automatically run the full stack.
No, this just determines what you visually see in terms of the squigglies, and it runs it for you behind the scenes. You would have to change the settings file or pointing to it, then you could make it do that. But what I would recommend is in launch.json, similar to where I've got scenarios like building and importing it so you can play with it, or build and running tests, you can run an inline script, and you could run invoke script analyzer like that. And with your customization pointing to your medium or very thorough set of settings. And you could have different levels, one for maybe code analysis, one for formatting. I think that's the best compromise in terms of getting things done quickly, because you just pick from it. And it doesn't have to be something to debug. It can be, just in this example here, a one-line script that you run that achieves something.
For splitting tab completion, does it have to be a minimal version of PowerShell?
I think it should work in Windows PowerShell as well. I have not tried it, but I would be surprised if it didn't work there. So it's now working in preview and stable extension. I think it's been 3 months since they added it. So try it out. If not, you might have to switch to PowerShell Core, but I would be very surprised if that was the case. Okay. If there's no further questions, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully there was something useful for you. Any other questions, feel free to come to me, and happy to answer. Thank you.